this is almost a flat landscape. And the road, the engineers didn't put enough culverts in or drain pipes. They save money or something. And so the road is actually acting as a low dam or dike to prevent the movement of water. And so we started thinking, well, how could the raised fields and then all of these raised causeways and canals that crisscross them maybe be integrated into a system of controlling water locally, but also in some cases over large areas. And so we started playing around with all kinds of techniques of geographic information systems and things. There's a little schematic showing the water coming out of the river in the flood season, from the sky during the rainy season, and also encroaching from below as the sort of landscape gets filled with water. And what they're doing is they're sort of slicing up the landscape into these little, essentially little drainage basins, and they can open and close these things to get the optimal level of water. So do a real quick little animation here, sort of primitive version of one, to show you how this might work. So we have two rivers here. The rivers run sort of parallel to each other, north-south. Along the rivers, they're carrying lots of sediment, so they tend to actually, the rivers tend to be sometimes perched or raised up above the surrounding landscape with all the sediment that flows over their banks and gathers there along the ridges. So sort of high ground along the rivers, low areas, and high ground. And so during the early wet season with the rains, they're probably trying to capture the first rains so they can use this water for moving around in those canoes that you saw, but also for agricultural purposes. During the middle of the rainy season, they probably can't control it much because pretty much the whole landscape is covered with water. But they're also interested in extending their growing season and being able to move around the landscape. So they're actually sort of trapping water and holding it there for their purposes long into the dry season. In most cases, these will eventually dry up for at least several months until the rains come the next year. So where do these people live? And I'm not that interested in archaeological sites, and there are plenty of other archaeologists, my colleagues, that are interested in these things, so I sort of let them do the sites. And we know they lived on these large earthen mounds, similar to the tells of the Near East and other areas of the world, simply people living there, building it up a little bit, their buildings collapsing, building it up a little more, and so these represent thousands, maybe multiple thousands of years of accumulation. But the majority of these, where they lived, are small little forest islands that are artificial. And you see cows down there, little white dots, or cows for scale. This one has a slight sort of area around it. If you know the plants, they're little aquatic plants, so it has a low area around, almost like a moat. And that's where they took the soil to build up this surface that sustains trees today. And every one that we've tested, did a couple of excavations on these, we put cores through them, we always come up with human remains indicating that these were settlements. And one of my colleagues estimated there are 20,000 of these little forest islands across the savannas. I don't know how accurate that is, but you think each one might have been a hamlet or a village, maybe occupied at the same time, maybe not. That's a huge population. So in 2007, 2008, we generally work out on the savannas, but there was some massive floods, probably due to El Nino year, and so we tried to work in the savannas, and it was just too much work wading through water, knee-deep and waist-deep sometimes each day. So he said, let's not work in the savannas this year, let's go up on the drier forest islands. And so I did know that I eventually wanted to look at these so-called geoglyphs, or ring ditches. And so this is one here in a small community called Hasiakiri. You can see the plaza today with some houses around to give you kind of a scale. It's about the size of a football field in the upper part, and some roads. And then that circle there you see are tall trees growing in the ditch of probably a medium size, one of these earthworks. This is one in a fairly recently cleared field, and this is a D-shaped one. There are all different kinds of shapes and sizes of these. This is an octagon-shaped one, which is interesting, and it actually has part of a ditch where they were going to expand it up there and make it larger that they gave up on, which is kind of interesting, sort of stop the work. They go by various names, as I mentioned. Generally, I'll use ring ditch in this talk, and all kinds of different depths, forms, widths, and things like this. I'll show you some of them. They also occur together in groups, in clusters. So in this case, you see the D one I showed you there before. there's actually 4, and we now know 5 here, all clustered together within stone's throw of each other. Why do they need so many of these things? Were they all in use at once or not? And what's exciting is when we get back into the deeper forests, that they're much better preserved because the cattle and the erosion hasn't occurred there. And literally, you can almost fall into these things as you're going through the forest. I have these machete cutters, and they're cutting trails, and all of a sudden they disappear in these deep, deep ditches that are not natural. So we're interested in figuring out sort of their dimensions is one thing, to look at issues of monumentality and the labor invested in these things. So we do simple cross-sections of them to figure out sort of what the cross-section is. Then we can multiply that by the distance of the ditch. And usually they're circular, they come all the way around and sort of form a full circle. And then we can do some volumetric, sort of calculate how many cubic yards or cubic meters of soil was moved in their construction. This is doing a fairly deep one. These are pretty easy to do, and my team can do 4 or 5 of these in a single ditch quickly, and then we move on to the next one. This is a particularly deep one, well preserved in an area where it doesn't have ranching and a lot of erosion. Get a sense of what these things might have looked like in the past, but they're, of course, they're at least 500, maybe more years old. So even in these, substantial erosion has occurred. I leave my GPS on when we're doing survey all the time as a nice memory card. So you can see our paths there as we move around the landscape, the purple lines. And then you can see where we found ring ditches. Many of these are known by the local people. Some of them we find on our own, showing 4 or 5 of them on a single forest island. And there's almost, we can kind of predict if an island is a certain size, we can predict there'd be maybe 1. If it's a certain size, we predict there might be 2 or 3. Usually they're on each end of a long linear island. And so, what do we know about the archaeology of these? So I've visited now almost 60 of these, and some of the ones in forests, you're not going to find much on the surface. You have to dig down, and we're not excavating these yet. But in the ones that are disturbed, we usually find pottery, but not a whole lot. And compared to the settlements that I've visited, many of these, the prehistoric settlements, they're chock full of pottery and all kinds of remains from people living there. So we were lucky in when a community decided to build a soccer field inside one of them. This is the one I showed, the first one I showed you from Hasekiri. They brought a road grader in, and they allowed us to kind of follow behind the grader, and we carefully sort of found stuff, recorded it, bagged it. And what was interesting is that it's not the kind of stuff you would find in a typical settlement. These are our fancy pottery vessels. This is probably a beer drinking mug about this size, hold maybe a quart of traditional beer, and highly decorated, the stuff you wouldn't see in most houses. So it shows something special about these sites. The locals will tell me, they'll go, "Clark, we know what these things were for." And it's usually the old guys. And they'll go, "We had lots of jaguars here in the past. Today, most of them have been killed off. And we had to protect our communities from the jaguars. And so we built these big ditches around the settlement so they wouldn't come in and steal our kids at night." And I think, oh, that's kind of an interesting story. Build a big ditch for keep jaguars out. And how would we ever prove that if we wanted to? And it wasn't until I went into a very remote area. I've never seen a jaguar in the wild, but we went to a very remote area where every single night you could hear them scouting us out in the dark around our camp. And there were at least 4 or 5 of them there. They kind of do this whoof kind of sound, kind of checking you out. And their prints are around our camp in the morning. And there are a lot of jaguars out in some of these areas. So I started thinking about it more because I kept hearing it over and over again. Peter Stahl, who's an archaeozoologist working with animal bones, he came down to work with me. I said, "Peter, could you do some research on jaguars? How far can they jump?" He said, "Sure." So he searched around the web. He found a manual of how to design zoos. And these are sort of the dimensions to create a zoo without fences. So you have essentially ditches, deep deep ditches that you keep the animals in, you know, make them look more natural in a zoo. And it's almost the same size as what we find in the earthworks. Now, how would we ever prove this? You know, I guess find a dead jaguar in the ditch or something, you know, doing an excavation. I think it's impossible, but it's something interesting, you know, and the locals are convinced that this is what they're for. Another insight is we found in the more remote areas, every time we got into the deep forest, I could figure out we would find a ring ditch if I saw more than 3 chocolate trees. And if you can see 3 from where you're standing, you're going to find a ditch. And sure enough, inevitably, you will find one, maybe in 5 minutes, maybe a minute. And this is a ring ditch, a very badly eroded one in a chocolate grove. Now, the locals call these wild chocolate groves, and they harvest them. Now the area is very famous for single-source chocolate, very high-quality chocolate. I think it's wonderful. I'm addicted to chocolate. And but the story is that Amazonian peoples didn't domesticate cacao for the chocolate. They didn't know how to do that. They drank a little low-alcohol beer from the sweetened fruit, the pod that you see here. And it was the Maya in the far north, in Central America and Mesoamerica, that invented the techniques to extract what we love, you know, chocolate. And it was reintroduced to South America as a cash crop by the Jesuits, who were looking to make money in their operations of civilizing peoples of Amazonia and other parts. This indicates that maybe something else might be going on, especially this association with these ring ditches. So you could ask any archaeologist. I could ask you guys, you know, you come up with hundreds of different things that these ditches could have been used for. And commonly, sort of assume that defense, you know, these are big constructions, they're deep, they surround something important maybe. They're probably not settlements. Maybe certain powerful people lived in these things. It could have been cemeteries. We do find burial urns in these sometimes. Some people suggested water management. Now, one thing that I resisted for so long, that these are associated with warfare and defense of communities. And I started rereading some of the early Jesuit accounts from the area, and they're very rich, detailed documents by bored priests who were stuck there in the middle of nowhere, who wrote lots about the communities they worked in. And they describe these kind of rundown palisades that are out in the forest, associated in some cases with deep ditches. And they asked the locals, say, oh yeah, there was a lot of warfare here in the past. And now you guys have sort of, you know, stopped the wars, and even though the Portuguese are coming across the border and attacking the communities and the Jesuit missions, but warfare had kind of died out. So I started thinking about this, and then a colleague of mine, Fernando Granero Santos, who's an ethnohistorian anthropologist, wrote a recent book, and he comes to the conclusion that in probably late prehistory and certainly the early colonial period, in the areas the Europeans hadn't controlled yet, that some 40 to 60% of the indigenous population was a slave of another group. And that means, you know, lots of capturing of people, and we have lots of descriptions also from Europeans, eyewitness accounts from military people, so they know what they're talking about. This is Hans Staden, who spent kind of a very scary year with the Tupinamba. They intended to eat him, fatten him up and eat him, on the coast of Brazil, and they lived in palisaded communities. These are very stylized, almost cartoon-like constructions, but you see these palisade walls protecting the settlements, people with bows and arrows. And Schmidl, my favorite, is a German mercenary who worked with the Spaniards in Buenos Aires and moved up into Paraguay, possibly Bolivia. And they fought every day with their mercenary armies of indigenous peoples to conquer and enslave a community. They did it every day. They go to a new community. Some of them they had to encircle, maybe besiege for a while. And thousands of people died, and thousands were dragged into slavery. And then they move up the river to the next one. So this probably was pretty widespread. Then I started thinking more and more as we went deeper into the forest, you know, some of these are actually even difficult today after 500 or more years to get in and out of. And so they actually could have worked to keep human beings from crossing, especially if they had straight vertical sides, maybe some sharpened stakes at the bottom, or a bunch of poisonous snakes, or a jaguar down there. It would probably work as protection.